This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Go ahead, the billionaire said with a thin smile, lifting his glass as the room quieted around him. Let's see if our waitress can answer something harder than the dessert menu. The laughter came quickly, the kind that spreads across a polished dining room like spilled champagne, light and careless and a little too loud. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the warm glow of chandeliers, and somewhere near the grand piano a quiet jazz melody drifted through the air, smooth and expensive. Ethan Crawford was used to rooms like this. Rooms where people leaned in when he spoke. Rooms where deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were decided between bites of filet mignon and sips of 30-year scotch. At 38 years old, Ethan Crawford had built a fortune most people only read about in magazines. His tech logistics empire stretched from San Francisco to Singapore, and tonight's charity gala in Manhattan was supposed to be another easy victory. Smile for the donors, write a large check, shake the right hands. Instead, he found himself slightly bored. And boredom had always been Ethan's most dangerous habit. Across the table, one of his investors leaned closer and chuckled into his whiskey. Come on, Ethan, the man murmured. Don't tell me you're afraid the waitress might actually win. More laughter. A few curious guests turned in their seats to watch. The woman standing beside the table hadn't said a word yet. Claire Bennett held a small leather order pad in one hand, the other resting calmly at her side. Her uniform was simple. Black vest, crisp white shirt, black slacks pressed neatly enough to satisfy the strict manager who ran the dining room. Her blonde hair was tied back in a low ponytail, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to draw attention. In a room full of silk gowns and custom suits, she was easy to overlook. Most people did. Ethan studied her for the first time since she'd walked up with the coffee service. She didn't look nervous. That was unusual. Most servers shifted their weight when they stood at his table, their smiles a little tighter, their voices a little higher. People tended to recognize him eventually. The watch on his wrist alone, a Patek Philippe worth more than many cars, usually gave the hint away. But Claire Bennett simply waited. Calm, patient, almost as if the laughter around her had nothing to do with her at all. Ethan set his glass down. All right, he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, perfectly comfortable in the center of attention. Here's the game. A few more diners nearby turned toward the table now, sensing entertainment. Charity galas could be painfully predictable, and unexpected drama was always welcome between courses. Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the tablecloth. Behavioral economics, he said. Loss aversion. Why do people fear losing $20 more than they enjoy gaining 20? Someone at the table smirked. Another guest whispered, she's going to dump the coffee on him. Claire tilted her head slightly, considering the question the same way a teacher might consider a student's homework. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but perfectly clear. Because the human brain processes potential loss in the amygdala before the reward system fully engages, she said. Which means emotionally, the threat hits first. The laughter stopped. It didn't fade. It stopped. Ethan blinked once. That answer had come far too quickly. Claire continued calmly, as if she were explaining the daily specials. Most people believe it's about money, she said, but it's actually about perceived survival risk. Losing something activates the same neural pathways as physical danger. The investor across from Ethan lowered his glass slowly. Well, he said quietly, that's oddly specific. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. Very interesting. All right, he said, a hint of challenge entering his voice now. Let's raise the stakes. A couple of guests shifted in their chairs, suddenly more alert. The game had changed. Ethan leaned forward, folding his hands together. If you're so confident, he said smoothly, tell me why investors overreact during market corrections even when the fundamentals haven't changed. Claire didn't answer immediately this time. She set the coffee pot gently on the table and straightened one of the folded napkins beside Ethan's plate. The movement was small, almost thoughtful, like someone adjusting a crooked painting on the wall. When she finally spoke again, her tone was exactly the same as before. Calm, professional, unimpressed. Because markets aren't driven by data first, she said. They're driven by narrative. Ethan felt something unfamiliar flicker behind his confidence. Curiosity. Claire met his eyes for the first time since the conversation began. And right now, she added gently. The narrative at this table seems to be that a billionaire is trying very hard to prove he's the smartest person in the room. A quiet gasp slipped from someone nearby. Then silence spread across the room like a ripple through still water. Ethan Crawford had spent most of his life controlling every room he entered. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he had the distinct feeling that the game had just changed, and he wasn't entirely sure he was the one winning anymore. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected. It was the kind of silence that did not come from discomfort, but from recalculation, as if every person within 20 feet of the table had suddenly realized they had misjudged the scene unfolding in front of them. Ethan Crawford remained perfectly still for a moment, his fingers lightly touching the edge of his crystal glass. He had built an empire on fast thinking and faster instincts. Yet for the first time that evening, he found himself studying someone rather than controlling the conversation. Across from him, one of the investors let out a quiet laugh that sounded almost nervous. "Well," the man said, clearing his throat, "that is not the answer I expected tonight." A few other guests chuckled, but the laughter felt different now. It no longer circled Claire Bennett like a target. Instead, it hovered uncertainly around Ethan himself. The jazz pianist in the corner continued playing softly, unaware that the temperature of the room had shifted several degrees. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. He did not look angry. That alone surprised the people who knew him well. Normally, when someone challenged him publicly, the response came sharp and immediate, like a blade drawn from a sleeve. But tonight something else had taken over. Curiosity. Narrative. Ethan repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it were unfamiliar. "That is your answer." Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." The title sounded polite, but it carried none of the nervousness he usually heard from service staff. She stood comfortably beside the table, not defensive, not triumphant, simply waiting to see whether the conversation would continue or end. Ethan drummed his fingers lightly on the tablecloth. "And what narrative would that be exactly?" he asked. Claire did not hesitate. "The one where the most powerful person in the room needs to prove it," she said. A few heads turned again. Somewhere near the bar someone whispered, "Did she just say that to him?" Ethan's mouth curved slightly at one corner, not quite a smile, not quite irritation. It had been years since someone had spoken to him with that level of quiet honesty. Usually people softened their words around wealth. They polished them, adjusted them, turned them into compliments even when criticism might have been deserved. Claire Bennett had skipped that step entirely. One of the donors at the neighboring table leaned toward the conversation with open interest now. "All right," the man said. "I want to hear where this goes." Ethan noticed the attention gathering like a spotlight around the table. Normally, he thrived in that kind of environment. Tonight, he felt something else stirring beneath the surface. A small but unmistakable challenge. He lifted his glass again and took a slow sip of scotch before setting it down carefully. "You answered the theory," he said. "But theory is easy." Claire raised one eyebrow slightly. "Is it?" Ethan ignored the remark and continued. "Tell me something practical," he said. "If you were so confident about narratives, explain the last market panic. 2 weeks ago, technology stocks dropped 8% in 48 hours. What? A few of the men at the table exchanged glances. Now the question had moved from clever banter into real territory. Claire glanced briefly toward the dining room, checking the other tables in her section the way a professional server always did. No one needed anything immediately. The room had become so focused on this exchange that even the wait staff nearby seemed to pause their movements for a moment. She turned back to Ethan. "Because fear travels faster than data," she said. "Investors watch each other more than they watch the fundamentals." Ethan tilted his head. "Explain." Claire folded her order pad closed, slipping the pen into the spine. "When uncertainty enters the market," she said calmly, "people do not just ask what the numbers say. They ask what everyone else will do next. The first group sells because they are nervous. The second group sells because the first group sold. And by the time the third group reacts, the narrative becomes panic." One of the investors at Ethan's table sat up straighter. "That is actually correct," the man murmured almost to himself. Claire continued, still in the same measured tone. "The market recovers later because the underlying companies did not change. Only the story changed." Ethan watched her closely now. Not the uniform, not the order pad. Her eyes. Clear, steady, completely unbothered by the fact that she was explaining investor psychology to a billionaire surrounded by financial executives. Something about that composure intrigued him more than the answer itself. "You talk like someone who studies markets," he said. Claire shrugged lightly. "I read." The understatement was almost amusing. Ethan tapped the table again, slower this time. "You read," he repeated. Across the room, the jazz pianist shifted into a new melody, softer and slower than before. The restaurant lighting reflected off the polished marble floor and the long bar where expensive bottles stood in neat rows. Everything about the room suggested wealth and certainty. Yet standing beside the table was a woman in a black server uniform who had just dismantled 2 economic questions with the calm confidence of a professor. Ethan Crawford had built companies by noticing things others ignored. And right now, Claire Bennett had become the most interesting anomaly in the entire room. For a few seconds no one spoke. The restaurant continued breathing around them, waiters moving quietly between tables, glasses being refilled, silverware touching porcelain with soft, delicate sounds. Yet the center of gravity in the room had shifted toward a single table where a billionaire and a waitress now stood locked in a conversation no one had expected to witness tonight. Ethan Crawford studied Claire Bennett carefully. He had spent most of his adult life identifying talent in rooms filled with executives and entrepreneurs, and the instincts that built his empire were now whispering the same message again and again. Something about this woman did not belong in a server uniform. "You read," Ethan repeated slowly, as if testing the sentence for hidden meaning. Claire gave a small polite nod. "Yes, sir." Ethan leaned back in his chair again, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive now. Around him, several guests were still watching openly. The earlier laughter had completely disappeared, replaced by the quiet fascination people feel when a conversation becomes more interesting than the event itself. One of the investors at Ethan's table folded his arms. "All right," the man said with a grin, "I have to ask, where exactly do you do all this reading?" Claire glanced briefly toward the bar where another server was delivering a tray of sparkling water. "Mostly during lunch breaks," she replied calmly. A soft ripple of amusement moved through the surrounding tables. It was not mockery. It sounded more like respect. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Respect was something he normally commanded without effort. Yet somehow this waitress had earned it in less than 5 minutes simply by refusing to shrink in front of him. He tapped one finger gently against the tablecloth again. "Lunch break reading does not usually include advanced behavioral economics," he said. Claire's lips curved slightly, the faintest suggestion of humor touching her voice. "You would be surprised what people read when they are curious enough." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Curiosity. That word again. It lingered in his mind the same way a puzzle lingers in the mind of a mathematician who cannot quite solve the equation yet. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something, Claire," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Several people noticed. Claire noticed too. Her posture remained composed, but her eyes sharpened with quiet awareness. Ethan rarely addressed staff by name unless he had decided they mattered. "Yes, sir," she said. Ethan gestured lightly toward the dining room around them. The marble floors, the velvet chairs, the wall of glass overlooking the glowing Manhattan skyline, nearly 30 floors below. Most people in this room spent years studying markets, finance, or business strategy, he said. Yet you answered those questions faster than anyone at this table. Claire considered that for a moment. "Speed does not always mean certainty," she replied. "Sometimes it only means someone has thought about the problem before." Ethan watched her closely. The answer was careful, honest, but still incomplete. He had spent decades negotiating with people who tried to hide their experience. Claire Bennett was not hiding arrogance or ambition, but she was clearly hiding something else. A story. One of the donors at the neighboring table leaned closer, smiling openly now. "I have a feeling there is more to that explanation." Claire met the woman's gaze politely. "Everyone has a story," she said. "Mine just happens to include a coffee tray." The remark drew another quiet wave of laughter, but Ethan did not laugh this time. Instead, he looked down briefly at the polished silver spoon beside his plate, then back up at Claire with renewed focus. "You are not embarrassed to be here," he observed. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Should I be?" Ethan paused. That was not the answer he expected. "Many people would be," he admitted. Claire glanced down at the tray beside her, adjusting one of the coffee cups so it sat perfectly centered on the saucer. The motion was small but deliberate. "Work is not embarrassing," she said quietly. "Pretending to be something you are not is embarrassing." A few guests nodded at that. Ethan's investor across the table raised his eyebrows. That might be the most honest thing said in this room tonight. Ethan felt the corner of his mouth lift again, this time more openly. Claire Bennett had done something very rare. She had turned what began as a public test into a conversation he actually enjoyed. And Ethan Crawford almost never enjoyed losing control of a room. Almost. He rested both hands on the table now, studying her with open interest. "All right," he said slowly. "Let us assume for a moment that your curiosity extends beyond lunch break reading." Claire waited silently. Ethan leaned forward just a little more, his voice quieter now, less performative and more direct. "What would someone like you be doing in a place like this?" For the first time since the conversation began, Claire Bennett did not answer immediately. The jazz piano drifted softly through the air. Glasses clinked again somewhere behind them. And in that brief pause, Ethan Crawford realized something unexpected. He genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Claire Bennett let the question rest in the air for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she seemed to be deciding how much truth the room deserved. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to motion. A server walked past carrying a tray of appetizers. Someone at the far end of the dining room resumed a quiet conversation about venture capital. But several nearby tables were still listening. Ethan Crawford noticed that. People always leaned toward mystery. Claire adjusted the coffee pot on her tray with careful precision before she spoke. "I work here," she said calmly. The answer was simple. Too simple. A faint grin appeared on the face of the investor sitting across from Ethan. "That is technically correct," the man said. "But it is not what he meant." Claire glanced briefly at the man and then back at Ethan. "I know." Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table now, his interest no longer hidden. The earlier game had dissolved into something quieter but more compelling. "You speak like someone who has spent years studying systems," he said. "Markets, psychology, behavioral economics. Those are not casual interests." Claire gave a small, thoughtful nod. "No," she said. Ethan leaned back again, studying her carefully. The confidence in her voice did not sound borrowed. It sounded practiced, earned. The kind of tone that came from someone who had defended ideas in rooms far less friendly than this one. "So let me ask the question again," he said. "What would someone like you be doing here?" Claire looked toward the tall windows behind Ethan's table. The Manhattan skyline shimmered through the glass like a field of distant stars. 30 floors below, the city moved with its usual restless energy. Yellow taxis flowed through traffic. Streetlights blinked in quiet rhythm. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but still steady. "Sometimes life takes detours," she said. Ethan did not interrupt. "Sometimes those detours last longer than people expect." One of the nearby guests tilted her head slightly, intrigued. Ethan folded his hands together. "That sounds like a careful answer." Claire smiled faintly. "It is an honest one." Ethan watched her expression closely. There was no embarrassment there. No apology either. Only calm acceptance. "You studied economics," he said. It was not a question. Claire hesitated for half a second, then nodded once. "Yes." "Graduate school?" Claire nodded again. "Yes." The investor across from Ethan leaned forward. "Where?" Claire's eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan before she answered. "Columbia." The reaction around the table was immediate. A low murmur moved through the small crowd of listeners. Columbia University sat less than 3 miles away across the city, one of the most respected institutions in the country. The idea that a Columbia graduate was currently serving coffee in a Manhattan restaurant was unexpected enough to capture everyone's attention again. Ethan did not react right away. Instead, he studied her the same way he would examine a surprising data point during a board meeting. "A master's degree?" he asked. Claire shook her head slightly. "No." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Claire met his gaze calmly. "Doctorate." The word landed quietly, but its impact rippled through the table like a stone dropped into still water. The investor across from Ethan nearly laughed in disbelief. "You are telling us you have a doctorate in economics?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "Behavioral economics." The man blinked twice. "And you are working here?" Claire lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "I am working," she said. The correction was subtle but deliberate. Ethan Crawford had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without losing his composure. Yet at that moment, he found himself unexpectedly impressed. Not by the degree itself. Degrees could be bought with time and discipline. What impressed him was the way she carried the information. No pride. No defensiveness. Just quiet fact. Interesting, Ethan said slowly. The word felt insufficient. Around the dining room, a few people had returned to their meals, but the energy of the earlier exchange still lingered like electricity after a storm. Ethan leaned forward slightly again. "And what was your dissertation about?" he asked. Claire looked down briefly at the coffee tray, then back at him. "Narrative-driven market volatility," she said. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The same phrase she had used earlier. Narrative. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the pieces of the conversation rearranged themselves in his mind. He realized suddenly that Claire Bennett had not simply answered his earlier questions. She had been explaining her field of research. The investor across from him let out a slow whistle. That explains a lot. Ethan stared at Claire for another moment, then leaned back again, the corner of his mouth lifting into the faintest smile. "Well," he said quietly, "that certainly raises the stakes." Claire's expression did not change, but her eyes carried the smallest spark of amusement. "Does it?" she asked. Ethan picked up his glass once more, studying the woman standing calmly beside his table. Tonight had started with boredom. Now it felt like the most interesting conversation he had experienced in months. The word doctorate lingered in the air long after Claire Bennett had said it, like the last note of a piano chord that refuses to fade completely. Around the table, the energy shifted again. A moment ago, the guests had been watching a playful exchange between a powerful businessman and a quiet waitress. Now they were watching something else entirely. Ethan Crawford held his glass loosely in one hand, studying Claire with an expression that had replaced amusement with calculation. He had built a fortune by noticing patterns other people ignored, and the pattern forming in front of him did not make sense yet. A behavioral economics PhD serving coffee at a charity gala in Manhattan did not fit any model he knew. Narrative-driven market volatility, Ethan repeated slowly. The phrase sounded familiar in a way he could not place immediately. Claire nodded slightly. "Yes." Ethan leaned back again, eyes narrowing in thought. Somewhere in his memory, buried among thousands of articles, investor briefings, and conference panels, he felt the echo of that phrase. One of the donors sitting 2 chairs away suddenly leaned forward with visible excitement. "Wait," the man said. "I think I have heard that before." The table turned toward him. The man pulled out his phone quickly and began tapping the screen. A few seconds passed while he searched. Then his eyebrows shot upward. "I knew it," he said. He rotated the phone so the others could see the article displayed on the screen. The headline glowed under the restaurant lighting. "The Behavioral Narrative Effect in Modern Financial Markets." Columbia Economic Review. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He did not need to read the whole article to recognize the name printed beneath the title. Claire Bennett. The same name standing beside the table holding a coffee tray. Ethan looked up slowly. Claire met his gaze without flinching. "That paper was cited by 3 investment firms last year," the donor said. "It predicted the exact type of panic we saw in the technology sector this spring." The investor across from Ethan laughed softly in disbelief. "You are telling me the woman serving coffee tonight predicted a market correction that analysts on Wall Street missed?" Claire shifted the tray slightly in her hands. "Predictions are rarely that precise," she said calmly. "It was more of a probability model." Ethan was no longer smiling. He studied the article for another moment, then leaned back in his chair again, his expression thoughtful. A behavioral economics paper predicting investor panic. He remembered now. The model had circulated quietly through several hedge funds earlier that year. It described how narratives could amplify financial fear faster than economic data could stabilize it. At the time, Ethan had assumed the author was some quiet academic buried inside a university research office, not someone delivering coffee at a charity event. The investor across from him shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable." Claire lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "It is just research." Ethan set his glass down carefully. The sound of crystal touching the table seemed unusually loud. "Just research," he repeated. His tone carried a trace of disbelief now. Claire remained calm. "Yes." Ethan studied her again, this time not as an anomaly, but as a puzzle he intended to solve. That paper circulated through half the financial industry, he said. Several investment firms used its conclusions during the spring correction. Claire nodded slightly. I heard. Ethan leaned forward slowly, his voice quieter now. And you wrote it? Yes. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan Crawford had built companies worth billions of dollars. Yet at that moment he felt the rare sensation of being genuinely surprised. Not embarrassed. Not challenged. Simply surprised. He turned his gaze briefly toward the glowing skyline beyond the glass windows. The city moved endlessly beneath them, thousands of people chasing opportunity in every direction. And somehow one of the most interesting economic minds he had encountered recently was standing in a server uniform holding a coffee pot. Ethan looked back at her. So let me understand this, he said. You wrote a research paper that influenced investors managing billions of dollars. Claire nodded. Yes. And tonight you are working a dinner shift. Claire nodded again. Yes. Ethan exhaled slowly, then leaned back once more, resting his hands loosely on the table. A faint smile returned to his face, but this time it carried genuine respect. Well, he said quietly, that might be the most interesting resume I have encountered in years. Claire's eyes flickered with the smallest trace of humor. I did not bring copies. Ethan chuckled softly. The sound surprised several people at the table. He rarely laughed during business conversations. You might not need them, he said. Then he paused for a moment, studying her again with open curiosity. The earlier question returned to his mind, stronger than before. What was she doing here? Because one thing was now absolutely clear to Ethan Crawford. Claire Bennett was not simply a waitress with a doctorate. She was a mind that belonged in rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made. And yet she was standing in this one with a coffee tray, as calm as if none of it mattered at all. The quiet excitement around. The table did not fade after the discovery of Claire Bennett's research. Instead it deepened, turning the dinner conversation into something more thoughtful, more attentive. Ethan Crawford remained seated, his eyes fixed on Claire with the same focused look he used during high-level negotiations. Except this time, there were no contracts on the table, no legal teams whispering behind him. Only a coffee tray and a conversation that had unexpectedly become the most interesting part of the evening. Ethan rested one arm lightly against the back of his chair and tilted his head slightly. Tell me something honestly, he said. Claire waited. Ethan gestured briefly toward the article still glowing on the donor's phone screen. If your research reached the financial industry, then someone must have tried to recruit you. Claire did not answer immediately. The jazz piano shifted into a slower melody that drifted through the restaurant like quiet rain. Finally, she said, yes. The investor across the table leaned forward again with renewed curiosity. And Claire adjusted the coffee tray slightly in her hands. And life happened. The answer sounded simple, but something in the way she said it carried more weight than the words themselves. Ethan watched her carefully. For the first time since the conversation began, he sensed a boundary. Claire was not defensive. She was not embarrassed. But she had clearly decided how much of her story she was willing to offer tonight. Ethan respected that instinct. It was the same instinct strong negotiators used when they protected the most valuable parts of their position. Still, curiosity pressed forward again. Life, Ethan repeated. That is a very broad explanation. Claire gave a small smile. It usually is. One of the women at the neighboring table spoke up gently. Was it a career change? Claire shook her head slightly. Not exactly. Ethan remained quiet, letting the moment breathe. He had learned long ago that silence often encouraged people to continue speaking. After a few seconds, Claire added, my father became ill during my final year of research. The room softened almost instantly. It was not dramatic, just a small shift in tone. The donor holding the phone slowly lowered it onto the table. Ethan nodded once, understanding immediately. He had seen similar stories many times in the real world behind financial headlines. Brilliant people pulled away from promising careers because real life demanded something different. Hospitals are expensive, Ethan said quietly. Claire met his gaze and gave a small nod. Yes. Ethan did not ask further questions. He did not need to. The explanation filled in the missing pieces with quiet clarity. Behavioral economics doctorate. Academic research. A promising career path. Then medical bills. Responsibility. Real-life interruptions that no economic model ever captured perfectly. The investor across from Ethan exhaled slowly. That explains the detour. Claire shrugged lightly again. Temporary detours can last longer than expected. Ethan watched her for another moment. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only acceptance. That detail impressed him more than the degree itself. Many people would have carried frustration in that situation. Claire Bennett carried composure. Ethan reached for his glass again, but did not drink. Instead, he set it back down after a moment. "Do you plan to return?" he asked. Claire's eyes flickered briefly toward the skyline again before returning to Ethan. Eventually. The word carried quiet determination. Not hope. Not wishful thinking. Determination. Ethan leaned back slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face again. A behavioral economist who predicted market reactions. A researcher whose paper had influenced investment firms. And now a waitress working evening shifts while carrying the quiet patience of someone rebuilding a path step by step. The puzzle was beginning to make sense. One of the donors smiled warmly. "Well," the woman said, "the financial world clearly lost someone interesting." Claire's lips curved slightly. Maybe temporarily. Ethan finally allowed himself a fuller smile. It was the kind he reserved for moments when he discovered unexpected potential in a person or an idea. "I agree with that," he said. Claire glanced at him curiously. Ethan tapped the edge of the table with one finger again, but this time the gesture carried no challenge. Only consideration. "You know," he said slowly, "I spend most of my time surrounded by analysts who talk about markets in very predictable ways." Claire tilted her head slightly. Ethan continued. "But tonight a waitress explained investor psychology better than half of them." The investor across the table laughed softly. "That is not even an exaggeration." Claire shook her head lightly. It was just a conversation. Ethan studied her for another moment, then said quietly, "Sometimes conversations reveal more than resumes." The city lights shimmered through the windows again, reflecting softly in the glassware across the table. And as the conversation paused, Ethan Crawford realized something unusual had happened during the last 15 minutes. What began as casual entertainment had turned into genuine respect. For a while the conversation slowed, not because interest had faded, but because the mood of the table had shifted into something quieter and more thoughtful. The earlier laughter had disappeared completely, replaced by the calm curiosity that follows when people realize they have underestimated someone. Ethan Crawford rested both hands loosely on the table, watching Claire Bennett as if she had become the most interesting variable in an equation he had not expected to solve tonight. Around them the restaurant continued moving with quiet elegance. Waiters passed between tables carrying plates of salmon and steak. The piano melody drifted gently through the air. Outside the tall glass windows the Manhattan skyline glowed like a field of steady stars. Claire adjusted the coffee tray in her hands and glanced briefly toward another table that had just finished dessert. Duty had not disappeared simply because the room had turned its attention toward her. Ethan noticed the glance. "You should take care of your other tables," he said calmly. Claire nodded politely. "Thank you." She turned slightly, then paused for half a second as if remembering something. When she faced the table again her voice carried the same calm tone as before. "Would anyone like a refill before I step away?" The investor across from Ethan lifted his glass with a grin. "If you are offering economic advice with the coffee, I might take 2 cups." A few people laughed softly. Claire poured the coffee with steady hands. When she finished, she gave a small polite nod and stepped away from the table. Ethan watched her move across the dining room, balancing the tray effortlessly while greeting another group of guests with the same professional composure she had shown earlier. The woman who had discovered Claire's article leaned toward Ethan slightly. "You look like someone who just discovered a very unusual investment opportunity." Ethan smiled faintly. "Perhaps." The investor across from him lowered his voice. "You are thinking about hiring her." Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced again across the dining room where Claire was now speaking with an elderly couple, recommending a dessert with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her work well. "I am thinking about something," Ethan said finally. The investor chuckled. "That usually means you are already 3 steps ahead of everyone else." Ethan leaned back slightly and crossed one leg over the other. His mind had shifted into the same analytical rhythm he used during high-stakes negotiations. Claire Bennett had predicted market reactions with academic precision. Her research had influenced investment strategies across the industry. Yet she stood 30 feet away explaining cheesecake options to a retired couple from Connecticut. The contrast fascinated him. Do you know what the rarest resource in business is? Ethan asked quietly. The investor shrugged. Capital. Ethan shook his head once. No. He gestured toward the dining room, where Claire now carried a small dessert plate toward another table. Perspective. The investor followed his gaze. You think she has it? Ethan nodded slowly. She sees the system from outside the system. The woman beside them smiled. That sounds like something a behavioral economist would say. Ethan allowed himself a small laugh. Exactly. Across the room, Claire finished delivering the dessert and turned back toward the service station. For a moment, her eyes met Ethan's from across the distance. It was a brief glance, nothing dramatic. But in that moment, Ethan felt something unexpected again. Not just curiosity, respect. Claire walked back toward the table a minute later, her tray now empty. Is there anything else I can bring for you? She asked. Ethan studied her for a moment before answering. His voice carried the same calm tone he used when discussing serious business matters. Actually, he said, there might be. Claire waited. Ethan gestured toward the empty chair at the end of the table. When your shift ends tonight, he said, I would like to continue this conversation. The investor across from him raised his eyebrows with interest. Claire looked at the chair, then back at Ethan. About coffee? She asked lightly. Ethan smiled. About markets, he said. Then he added, and perhaps about why someone who understands them so well is standing in this room holding a tray instead of shaping the decisions being made here. Claire considered his words for a moment. Her expression remained calm, but a thoughtful curiosity appeared in her eyes. That sounds like a long conversation. Ethan nodded once. It probably is. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Claire gave a small polite nod. My shift ends at 10 o'clock. Ethan glanced at the elegant watch on his wrist. It was just after 8:30. Plenty of time. He leaned back in his chair again, the faintest smile returning to his face. The evening had started with boredom. Now it promised something far more interesting. After Claire Bennett spoke the words about her shift ending at 10 o'clock, the rhythm of the evening quietly resumed. Plates arrived. Glasses were refilled. Conversations returned to the polite murmur typical of charity dinners in Manhattan. Yet something subtle had changed in the atmosphere around Ethan Crawford's table. It was no longer the center of a spectacle. Instead, it had become the center of quiet curiosity. Ethan leaned back in his chair and glanced once more at the watch on his wrist. 8:35. Time moved differently when something interesting appeared unexpectedly. Across the dining room, Claire continued working with the same steady composure she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She carried plates, refilled water glasses, and answered questions about the menu with calm efficiency. To anyone who had not heard the earlier conversation, she looked exactly like any other professional server doing her job well. Ethan noticed that detail more than anything else. Most people who suddenly became the focus of attention either grew nervous or confident. Claire did neither. She simply returned to work. The investor sitting across from Ethan shook his head slowly as he watched her move between tables. I still cannot believe this, the man said quietly. A behavioral economist with a doctoral degree predicted market panic, and now she is recommending cheesecake. Ethan smiled faintly. Human behavior is complex, he replied. The man laughed softly. That sounds like something she would say. Ethan lifted his glass and took a small sip of scotch before setting it down again. His mind had already moved beyond the novelty of the situation. Instead, it was exploring possibilities the way it always did when he encountered unusual talent. He had built his companies by recognizing potential before others noticed it. Claire Bennett clearly possessed something rare. Insight combined with patience. Intelligence combined with humility. The woman sitting beside him leaned slightly closer. You are definitely going to offer her a job. Ethan glanced at her and raised an eyebrow. That obvious? She nodded with an amused smile. You have the same expression you had when you acquired that analytics firm in Seattle. Ethan chuckled quietly. That company tripled its value in 2 years. Exactly, she said. Across the dining room, Claire returned to Ethan's table briefly with a pitcher of water. May I refresh your glasses? She asked. Ethan nodded. As she poured the water, he studied her again, this time with a more thoughtful gaze. How much longer is your shift? He asked. Claire glanced toward the service station, where a small digital clock displayed the time. About an hour and 20 minutes, she said. Ethan nodded once. Then I will wait. Claire tilted her head slightly. You do not have other meetings tonight. Ethan smiled faintly. Not ones that suddenly became more interesting. Claire did not respond to the compliment directly. Instead, she finished pouring the water and placed the pitcher back on her tray. I should return to the floor, she said politely. Ethan nodded again. Of course. Claire stepped away once more, disappearing briefly toward the kitchen doors where several other servers moved in coordinated rhythm. The investor across from Ethan leaned forward again. You realize this could change her entire career. Ethan shrugged lightly. Possibly. You say that like it is a casual decision. Ethan glanced toward the skyline beyond the glass windows. It is not casual, he said. But opportunity rarely arrives through formal channels. The investor followed his gaze toward the city lights. You really believe she belongs in your world? Ethan shook his head slowly. No, the man looked confused. Ethan smiled slightly and corrected himself. I believe she belongs in a world where her thinking matters. The table grew quiet for a moment after that. Across the dining room, Claire finished clearing another table and paused briefly at the service station, writing something on a small order pad. Ethan noticed the way she moved. Not rushed. Not distracted. Focused. A mind that understood systems often approached ordinary tasks with the same careful efficiency. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The dinner slowly shifted into its final phase as dessert plates appeared across the room and conversation softened. Ethan glanced again at his watch. 9:10. The investor leaned back in his chair and smiled. You are not used to waiting, are you? Ethan considered the question. Not usually. The man laughed quietly. Yet here you are. Ethan looked across the dining room again, where Claire Bennett was now speaking with a group of guests near the window, explaining something about the house specialty cake with calm clarity. For a moment, the city lights reflected behind her like a quiet constellation. Ethan rested his hands loosely on the table and allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. Waiting, he realized, was not always inefficient. Sometimes it was simply the beginning of a very interesting conversation. By the time the large clock above the service station reached 9:30, the restaurant had settled into the comfortable rhythm that follows the peak of a dinner service. The loud conversations had softened into smaller clusters of quiet laughter and gentle discussion. Dessert plates were being cleared, espresso cups replaced wine glasses, and the piano melody drifting through the room carried a slower, reflective tone. Ethan Crawford remained seated at his table, calm and patient, something his business partners rarely saw outside of a negotiation room. His investors had gradually returned to their own conversations, though every so often someone still glanced across the dining room toward Claire Bennett with a look of curiosity that had not completely faded. Ethan himself did not hide the fact that he was watching her, not in an intrusive way, but with the attentive interest of someone studying a pattern that had not yet revealed its full shape. Claire moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm she had shown all evening. She collected empty glasses, thanked guests for attending the charity event, and occasionally exchanged small polite conversations with diners who seemed eager to learn more about the woman who had quietly surprised half the room earlier. Yet she never lingered too long at any table. Work came first. At one point, she paused near the service station to help another server organize a tray of dessert forks. The younger server leaned toward her and whispered something that made Claire smile briefly. Ethan noticed that smile. It was the first time he had seen her relax even slightly since the conversation at his table began. The investor across from Ethan followed his gaze and chuckled softly. You really are analyzing this entire situation like it is a business acquisition. Ethan did not look away from the dining room. Observation is useful in many fields, he said calmly. The man shook his head with amusement. You are waiting for the right moment. Ethan nodded once. Timing matters. Across the room, Claire delivered a final check to a couple near the window. They thanked her warmly before standing and gathering their coats. As they left the restaurant, one of them shook Claire's hand with visible admiration. Ethan noticed that detail as well. Respect, he thought, rarely came from titles alone. It came from presence. 10 minutes passed. The dining room slowly began to thin as guests filtered toward the elevators or the bar for a final drink. The charity organizers moved between tables, thanking donors for their contributions. The atmosphere had become relaxed and unhurried. At 9:45, Claire returned briefly to Ethan's table once more with a pitcher of water. One last refill before the evening ends, she asked. Ethan nodded. As she poured the water, he spoke quietly. Almost finished. Claire glanced toward the service station clock again. 15 minutes. Ethan rested his hands on the table. I will still be here. Claire met his eyes for a moment. Her expression carried calm curiosity rather than surprise. You seem very certain. Ethan smiled slightly. I am patient when something is worth waiting for. Claire gave a small thoughtful nod, but did not reply. She finished pouring the water and stepped away again, disappearing through the kitchen doors. The investor across from Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. You know something interesting, he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What? The man gestured toward the dining room, where the last few guests were finishing their drinks. Most people in this room spent their careers trying to impress you. Ethan considered the statement. And? The investor smiled. She did not try at all. Ethan looked toward the kitchen doors where Claire had just disappeared. Exactly. 5 minutes later the doors opened again, and Claire stepped back onto the dining floor. The pace of the restaurant had slowed enough that only a few remaining tables required attention. She cleared 2 plates, wiped down a nearby table, and spoke briefly with the manager before removing the small server apron from around her waist. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The shift was ending. Claire folded the apron neatly and placed it beside the service station. Then she checked the clock one final time. 10 o'clock. She spoke briefly with another server, gathered her small bag from beneath the counter, and walked calmly toward Ethan's table. The restaurant lighting reflected softly across the marble floor as she approached. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair, the faint smile returning to his face. Claire stopped beside the table with the same composed posture she had carried all evening. My shift has ended, she said simply. Ethan nodded. The city lights shimmered behind her through the tall windows, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Ethan gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Good, he said quietly. Then the real conversation can begin. Claire Bennett pulled out the empty chair and sat down with the same calm composure she had carried all evening, placing her small bag beside the table as if this were simply another conversation rather than a moment that had quietly gathered the attention of half the dining room earlier. Ethan Crawford watched her carefully, noticing how naturally she shifted from server to equal participant in the discussion without any trace of awkwardness. Around them the restaurant had grown quieter as most of the guests had already left, leaving only a few scattered tables finishing late coffees beneath the soft golden light of the chandeliers. Outside the glass walls the Manhattan skyline shimmered in the cool night air, traffic moving far below like quiet rivers of light. Ethan rested his hands loosely on the table and studied her with the thoughtful focus he usually reserved for business strategy meetings. First, he said calmly, thank you for sitting down. Claire gave a small nod. You waited. Ethan smiled slightly. I said I would. For a moment neither of them spoke. The pause did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would shape the direction of the conversation in ways neither had fully predicted when the evening began. Ethan finally leaned back in his chair. You predicted investor panic using narrative theory, he said. Claire nodded once. Yes. And that model circulated through several hedge funds. Yes. Ethan folded his hands together. So I am curious about something. Claire tilted her head slightly, waiting. Why did you publish the research instead of building something with it? He asked. Claire's expression softened with a small, thoughtful smile. You mean a company? Ethan nodded. Exactly. Claire glanced briefly toward the skyline before answering. Because my goal was understanding behavior, she said. Not monetizing it. Ethan chuckled quietly. You realize you might be the only economist in New York who answered that question that way. Claire smiled faintly. Possibly. Ethan leaned forward slightly now, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had built an entire empire of technology firms and analytics companies. Let me tell you something about the financial world, he said. Most people in my industry are very good at analyzing data after something happens. Claire nodded slowly. Retrospective certainty. Ethan smiled. Exactly. He tapped the table lightly with one finger. Very few people understand the psychology that drives events before they happen. Claire listened quietly. Ethan continued. Your paper was not interesting because it explained past behavior. It was interesting because it predicted the emotional chain reaction before it appeared in the data. Claire considered that for a moment. Markets are human systems, she said calmly. Data moves slower than emotion. Ethan nodded once. Which is exactly why I wanted to continue this conversation. Claire raised one eyebrow slightly. You believe my research has practical value. Ethan leaned back again, smiling slightly. I believe your research has enormous practical value. Claire rested her hands lightly on the table. And you believe you can use it? Ethan laughed softly. Of course. Claire's eyes carried a trace of amusement. At least you are honest. Ethan nodded. Always. He studied her expression for another moment before speaking again. What if I told you that my companies spend millions of dollars every year trying to predict human decision patterns in financial markets? Claire listened without interrupting. Ethan continued calmly. And what if I told you that most of those models fail because they rely entirely on historical data? Claire nodded slowly. That is a common limitation. Ethan gestured toward her lightly. You approach the problem differently. Claire tilted her head. Narrative structures. Ethan smiled. Exactly. For a moment the two of them sat quietly as the significance of the conversation settled into place. The investor across the table watched with growing curiosity, clearly aware that the conversation had moved far beyond polite dinner talk. Ethan leaned forward slightly again. So let me ask you something directly, he said. Claire met his gaze calmly. Ethan's voice remained steady but carried the quiet seriousness of a genuine opportunity. What would you say if I told you I wanted to build a behavioral analytics division based entirely on your research? Claire did not react immediately. Instead, she studied Ethan carefully, as if evaluating not just the offer but the man making it. The city lights flickered softly through the glass behind them, while the final notes of the piano melody drifted across the nearly empty dining room. After a moment, Claire spoke again. I would say, she said calmly, that you probably expect me to say yes. Ethan smiled slightly. Most people would. Claire returned the faint smile with one of her own. I am not most people. Ethan's expression brightened with quiet interest. That, he said softly, is exactly why I asked. Claire Bennett's faint smile lingered after she said the words, and for the first time since the conversation began, Ethan Crawford leaned back slightly, letting out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. It was not the laugh of a man offended. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard exactly the response he had expected from the one person in the room who refused to behave predictably. The nearly empty restaurant glowed softly around them, the last few guests finishing their coffees while the piano player shifted into a gentle, closing melody. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the table and studied Claire with renewed interest. You are correct, he said calmly. Most people would say yes immediately. Claire tilted her head slightly. Because most people are being offered a large salary by a billionaire. Ethan nodded once. That tends to influence decision-making. Claire folded her hands lightly together on the table. Behavioral economics again. The small joke drew a quiet chuckle from Ethan. Fair point. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the glass walls the city lights shimmered across the river, reflecting off the windows like distant stars. Ethan broke the silence first. So tell me, he said. Why are you not most people? Claire considered the question carefully. When she spoke, her voice carried the same steady calm she had shown since the beginning of the evening. Because I did not spend years studying human decision-making just to become another predictable decision. Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. That is a very economist answer. Claire smiled faintly. It is an honest one. Ethan leaned forward again, curiosity replacing any trace of disappointment. Then help me understand your hesitation. Claire looked at him directly now. You are offering opportunity, she said. But you are also offering speed. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. And speed is dangerous when you are rebuilding a life. The sentence landed with quiet weight between them. Ethan did not interrupt. Claire continued calmly. Right now I work 60 hours a week between this restaurant and tutoring students in the mornings. I pay hospital bills that still arrive every month. I help support my mother while she recovers. My schedule may not look impressive on paper, but it is stable. Ethan listened carefully. The honesty in her explanation carried no self-pity, only clarity. Claire rested her hands lightly on the table. Your offer could change everything quickly, she said. But quick changes sometimes come with expectations I may not be ready to meet yet. Ethan watched her expression for a moment before responding. You believe I expect immediate results? Claire nodded once. Most people who build billion-dollar companies do. Ethan smiled slightly at the accuracy of that observation. You are not wrong. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. I spent years studying how pressure changes human decision-making, she said. Ironically, I would prefer not to place myself inside that pressure before I am ready. Ethan tapped the table gently with one finger, thinking. The investor across from them listened with quiet fascination as the conversation unfolded in a way no one at the dinner had anticipated. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Let me ask you something different. Claire nodded. All right. Ethan gestured lightly toward the skyline outside. When you wrote that research paper, he said, did you imagine it might influence how large investment firms think about markets? Claire smiled faintly. No, then why publish it? Claire looked thoughtful for a moment. Because knowledge is useful when it circulates, she said. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. Claire raised one eyebrow slightly. You believe the same principle applies to building companies. Ethan smiled. Now you are following my thinking. Claire leaned forward slightly again. But circulation does not require ownership, she said. Ethan's eyes sharpened with interest. Explain. Claire spoke calmly. You want to build a behavioral analytics division based on my research, she said. Ethan nodded once. Yes. Claire continued. What if instead of hiring me immediately, you funded an independent research partnership? Ethan did not respond right away. Claire continued slowly, choosing each word carefully. A small team. Real-world data access. Freedom to test. The narrative model in live market environments. Ethan's investor sat up slightly at the idea. Claire finished the thought. If the model works in practice, then we build something larger. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, studying her with clear admiration now. You negotiated that in less than 30 seconds. Claire smiled faintly. I told you. I study decision-making. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head with genuine respect. Claire Bennett, he said quietly. You might be the first person who turned down a billionaire job offer and made the opportunity more interesting instead. Claire met his gaze calmly. That was the goal. Ethan rested his hands on the table again, the faint smile still present on his face. Then I think, he said slowly. This conversation just became a partnership discussion. For a moment after Claire Bennett finished explaining her idea, the table fell into a thoughtful silence. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that appears when two intelligent minds suddenly recognize the outline of something larger than the conversation that created it. Ethan Crawford leaned back slowly in his chair, folding his hands together while the final notes of the piano drifted across the nearly empty dining room. His investor watched him carefully, clearly waiting for the reaction that usually followed when someone challenged Ethan's way of doing business. But Ethan did not react with impatience. Instead, a slow smile appeared on his face, the kind that meant his mind was already racing through possibilities. You did not just negotiate a partnership, Ethan said quietly. You redesigned the entire structure of the offer. Claire returned a calm smile. Structures matter. Ethan nodded once. Yes, they do. Outside the tall glass windows, the Manhattan skyline continued glowing beneath the night sky, the distant sound of traffic moving like a soft current far below the restaurant. The charity event had almost completely ended now, leaving only a few staff members clearing the last tables. Ethan tapped one finger lightly against the table as he thought. You want freedom to test your theory, he said. Claire nodded. Yes. Access to real-world market data. Yes. Ethan tilted his head slightly. And no direct employment contract. Claire nodded again. Correct. Ethan laughed quietly, shaking his head with genuine admiration. Most people negotiate for more money. Claire shrugged lightly. Money is a tool. Ethan looked at her. Carefully. You want proof. Claire met his gaze. I want the model to survive contact with reality. Ethan's investor leaned forward slightly, clearly fascinated. She is designing a research laboratory using your companies as the testing environment. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly, Claire added calmly. And if the model fails, then the cost of that failure belongs to the research process rather than to an employee who was hired too early. Ethan smiled again. You are protecting your independence. Claire nodded. Yes. Ethan rested his arms lightly on the table and looked at her for several seconds before speaking again. You know what the most interesting part of this entire conversation is? Claire tilted her head slightly. What? Ethan gestured lightly toward the empty restaurant around them. When this evening began, he said, I thought I was entertaining myself by asking a waitress a difficult question. Claire smiled faintly. And now, Ethan leaned forward slightly. Now I am sitting across from someone who might change how my companies understand human behavior in financial markets. Claire listened quietly. Ethan continued. And she refused the easiest path because she prefers the correct one. Claire's expression softened slightly. The correct path is usually slower. Ethan nodded. But sometimes it leads further. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the table while the last restaurant staff quietly polished glasses behind the bar. The investor finally leaned back and laughed softly. I think this might be the first business meeting in history that started with a coffee refill. Ethan chuckled. Possibly. Claire glanced briefly toward the service station where her folded apron still rested on the counter. I should probably go home soon, she said. Ethan nodded. Of course. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, sliding it across the table toward her. Claire looked down at it, but did not pick it up immediately. The card carried Ethan Crawford's name, his direct number, and the discreet logo of the analytics firm that served as the core of his technology empire. Call me tomorrow afternoon, Ethan said calmly. We can discuss what the research partnership would look like. Claire finally picked up the card and studied it briefly before placing it inside her bag. All right. Ethan leaned back again, the thoughtful smile still present. And Claire? She looked up. Yes. Ethan spoke with quiet sincerity now. For the record, I am very glad you did not say yes earlier. Claire raised one eyebrow slightly. Why? Ethan's smile widened just a little. Because that would have been the predictable decision. Claire laughed softly, the sound light and genuine in the quiet restaurant. And we already established, she said calmly, that predictable decisions are dangerous. Ethan nodded once. Exactly. Claire stood up slowly from the chair, gathering her bag from beside the table. Good night, Mr. Crawford. Ethan stood as well. Ethan, he corrected gently. Claire considered that for a moment before smiling again. Good night, Ethan. Then she turned and walked calmly toward the elevator at the far end of the restaurant, disappearing beneath the soft glow of the lobby lights. Ethan remained standing for a moment watching the doors close behind her. His investor leaned toward him with a curious grin. So, the man asked quietly, did you just recruit a genius or start something much more complicated? Ethan looked toward the city skyline again and smiled thoughtfully. I think, he said slowly, I may have just met someone who refuses to think inside the same systems I built. The investor laughed. That sounds like trouble. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets and turned toward the exit. No, he said calmly. That sounds like the beginning of something interesting. The elevator doors closed softly behind Claire Bennett, and for a moment the quiet hum of the building seemed louder than the city outside. She stood alone beneath the warm light of the lobby ceiling, holding the small card Ethan Crawford had given her. The night air beyond the glass entrance looked cool and calm, the kind of New York evening where the city felt both endless and strangely peaceful at the same time. She stepped outside onto the sidewalk and paused for a moment, looking up at the skyline stretching above the streets like a constellation of glass towers and silent ambition. Somewhere high above those lights, decisions were made every day that moved billions of dollars across the world. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, Claire felt that those decisions might not be as far away from her life as they once seemed. The next afternoon arrived with quiet sunlight filtering between the tall buildings of Midtown Manhattan. Ethan Crawford sat inside the top-floor conference room of his analytics firm, the walls made entirely of glass overlooking the river. Several members of his leadership team sat around the long table, reviewing charts and data projections displayed across the screen. Yet Ethan's attention kept drifting toward the small card holder beside his laptop, where Claire Bennett's name had been written neatly on a note he had placed there that morning. His chief analyst noticed the distraction and smiled slightly. You are waiting for a call. Ethan did not deny it. Yes. The analyst leaned back in his chair. The waitress with the economics doctorate. Ethan gave a small nod. The behavioral economist who predicted market panic. The analyst chuckled softly. I read the paper last night after you sent it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And the analyst folded his arms thoughtfully. It is one of the clearest explanations of narrative-driven volatility I have seen in years. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. Exactly. At that moment, Ethan's phone vibrated quietly on the table. The room grew silent for a second as he glanced down at the screen. Claire Bennett. Ethan picked up the phone and answered calmly. Good afternoon. Claire's voice carried the same calm tone he remembered from the night before. Good afternoon, Ethan. Ethan leaned back in his chair, glancing briefly toward the skyline through the glass wall. I was hoping you would call. Claire laughed softly on the other end of the line. That would have been the predictable outcome. Ethan smiled. True. Claire continued. I thought about your proposal. Ethan listened quietly. And? Claire paused briefly before answering. I believe the research partnership could work. Ethan's smile widened slightly. Around the conference table, several executives watched him with curiosity. Good, Ethan said. Because I believe your model could change how markets are analyzed. Claire responded calmly. Only if it survives testing. Ethan nodded. Then we will test it. There was a small pause before Claire spoke again. There is one more condition. Ethan laughed quietly. Of course there is. The research team must include young economists who do not usually receive access to real market data. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You want to build opportunity into the system? Yes. Ethan considered the idea for a moment before nodding. Done. A small silence followed. Then Claire said something unexpected. Also, there is something else. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What is that? Claire's voice carried a faint trace of humor now. Next time we discuss economic theory, I would prefer not to be holding a coffee tray. Ethan laughed openly for the first time that day. That can be arranged. Claire continued. However, she added calmly, I still make very good coffee. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking out across the river where sunlight shimmered against the water. Then perhaps we should test that theory as well. Claire laughed softly. Are you inviting me to a meeting or a coffee? Ethan answered without hesitation. Both. Another quiet pause followed before Claire spoke again. All right. Ethan glanced toward the calendar screen on the wall. Dinner tomorrow evening? Claire hesitated only for a moment. Dinner sounds reasonable. Ethan smiled faintly. Good. Claire's voice softened slightly before the call ended. See you tomorrow, Ethan. As the line disconnected, Ethan placed the phone back on the table. His chief analyst leaned forward with a curious grin. So what was the outcome? Ethan looked toward the skyline again, the afternoon light reflecting across the glass buildings of the city. The research partnership is happening, he said calmly. The analyst nodded. And the waitress? Ethan smiled in a way that carried both curiosity and quiet excitement. She is not a waitress anymore. The analyst laughed. That was fast. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he said thoughtfully. That was inevitable. Outside the window, the city continued moving as it always had, unaware that a conversation that began with a cup of coffee had quietly created something new. And somewhere across Manhattan, Claire Bennett stepped out into the sunlight with a small smile, knowing that sometimes the most powerful turning points in life begin in the most ordinary moments. If this story touched you or made you think differently about people you meet in everyday life, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, share it with someone who enjoys meaningful stories, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more powerful narratives where intelligence, dignity, and unexpected connections change everything. Your support helps us bring more cinematic storytelling and unforgettable human moments to life. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey.